oh my God, relationships are like maybe not safe, or I can't really trust people, or like cis het men in particular are never fucking trustworthy people, and they're always... Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name's Mickey. I'm a therapist, and we talk about therapy things on this channel. Today, we are talking about the Try Guys and trauma, and the general question, what counts as trauma? How do you know if you're traumatized? That sort of a thing. I think this situation that unfolded with the Try Guys is an interesting way to educate about this issue, and I want to talk about big T and little t trauma today, because there has been a lot of discourse about this issue, and a lot of strong opinions, and so I wanted to talk about this in a way that honors the experiences of the people who are involved and also minimally drags victims of trauma through the mud. And so I'm going to try to be mindful and careful of that, but I do think I would be remiss as a clinician to not talk about this issue, because I've seen a lot of people speaking with authority about the topic of trauma without like the knowledge or education or experience. And so I want to do some educating, resource providing, you know, the thing. First and foremost, I want to talk about this tweet. Full disclosure, there is also another therapist who spoke about this on TikTok, and I did come across that, so I will put that in the description below. They bring up some interesting issues, some of which we're going to talk about, some of which we're not, so if you want to see the full context, go watch that in the description. But this tweet says, oh, now I have to sneeze. It passed, we're fine. The Try Guys describing their coworker cheating on his wife as their trauma is a great example of how the internet has taken important therapy language and bastardized it into silly little nothings. This tweet at the time actually received a lot of positive attention. Folks seem to be resonating with this sentiment, which is a little discouraging to me. And so again, this is like part of the reason I wanted to talk about it. First and foremost, I think there's a useful conversation to be had about types of trauma. One of the questions that gets asked in therapy all the time is like, is this really traumatizing? Or like, isn't that kind of dramatic to call this trauma? No, it's not. The thing that's like the core takeaway from this video, if you learn nothing else from this video, please understand that trauma doesn't have a fixed definition. Trauma is, first of all, unique to the individual based on our own life experiences and our own emotional and nervous system tolerance, but it's also something that is relatively simple in terms of like how we define it. Trauma, we talked about this in the birth trauma video that we put up last week. I will put that up here, but trauma in like the medical sense refers to a wound to the body. In the mental health field, it's very similar, where trauma usually is described or used to describe a wound or a stress or a difficult event that takes place and that changes or like affects our nervous system. The thing that's really important to note about trauma is that something that's traumatizing to me might not be traumatizing to you, but that doesn't take away from the validity of the trauma that a person has experienced. I feel like we should have a little counter in the corner for how many times I say the word trauma in this video. I think this is an important thing for us to talk about, particularly in this case, because I've seen a lot of strong opinions and honestly kind of like hateful sentiments like this tweet about how disingenuous it is to label something as trauma. Again, I think the key takeaway here that I want to encourage folks to sit with is that trauma is something that is highly subjective. So something that's traumatizing to me might just be like a regular Wednesday to you, but that doesn't take away the validity from the trauma of the person who's experienced it. I think this is super important to educate about, especially because when folks come to therapy, oftentimes there's a lot of fear and shame and like self-judgment about labeling something as traumatizing, because the fear is like, am I going to invalidate the experiences of others who have like the other people have it much worse than me thing. Like that's a very common sentiment, and it's very frustrating to me that we as a society continue to push this ideal that like you're not allowed to be traumatized unless you've experienced the most traumatizing event TM in the history of the world, and that's simply untrue, and also like very, very damaging to the work that the mental health field is seeking to do. I very much want to encourage folks to lean into validating your own trauma, but also to validating the trauma of others. Even if someone is labeling something as trauma that isn't trauma, I don't even know if that's possible, but maybe someone's exaggerating about something and calling it traumatic when it's not, it does not take anything away from you to validate and to honor someone else's experience. I think this is such an important thing to talk about too, especially on behalf of like parenting and caregiving and things like that, because a lot of the harmful ideals that I have helped folks work through in therapy personally relates to having trauma invalidated by primary caregivers. So I also want to talk about that. Another thing that I wanted to address here is the concept of like big T and little t trauma. It's like sort of a term that a lot of therapists and mental health professionals use, and it can be sort of confusing. So I wanted to educate about that as well. Big T trauma oftentimes refers to like the things that we typically as a society associate with trauma, right? So like surviving a natural disaster, surviving someone attacking or harming your physical body, those types of things, right? Big T trauma typically is surrounding fear for your own safety or your life or the safety or the life of another person. That's the verbiage that we see in the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual. I talk about that up here if you want to know what that is. But typically that's what big T trauma is related to. Little t trauma, however, is different. It's little in the sense that it is not like one big singular event that causes a person to be traumatized. It's a buildup and an accumulation of small little things over time that culminate in like a long-term traumatic effect. The example that I commonly give to clients or to folks that I'm educating about little t trauma are these little like side one-off comments and pot shots that a child might hear from a primary caregiver. I know that I'm talking a lot about parents in this video, by the way. I'm not trying to insinuate that all parents are bad parents. It's just that a lot of our trauma comes from childhood. So food for thought. For example, a child hearing comments about their body from a primary caregiver, not in a particularly aggressive or hurtful way, but in a offhanded way of like, ooh, those pants don't look good on you, or like, why don't you leave some leftovers on your plate, or you don't need seconds. Those types of comments aren't what someone would typically label as like big T trauma, right? However, when someone experiences those over time, they culminate in this larger trauma of shame, insecurity, fear, distrust, discomfort around one's body and their relationship with food. That's well and truly traumatizing. There is also another conversation to be had about complex trauma, wherein someone is repeatedly exposed to traumatizing stimuli in childhood. That's a different conversation for a different day. If you want me to make a video about that, let me know in the comments. I'll happily do that. But for the sake of things being succinct here, big T trauma is typically one big event. Little T traumas are usually smaller things that add up over time. Little T traumas can also be smaller things that someone wouldn't typically associate with trauma and are still a singular event. An example of little T trauma might be someone realizing the depths to which Britney Spears' conservatorship was abusive, right? That's not something that is a repeated event, and it's not something that directly happened to you, but it was still traumatizing for a lot of people to realize that someone that they looked up to, someone whose music and content that they consumed, and someone that they really liked and admired was actually being abused. That can feel very traumatizing and like cause us to have a shift in the way that we perceive trust and relationships and celebrities and the world and those types of things. That's the key thing that I want folks to take home about trauma. It's not just a conversation about like, was this distressing to you? Although that is like a key part of it. Trauma also changes the way that we view ourselves or the world or relationships or like some key component of life. This is especially important when we talk about the Try Guys situation, because in regards to this tweet and in regards to like the SNL skit, for example, which you haven't seen that. If you haven't seen that, by the way, I'll try and put a short clip of it here.
Turning back to the actual news, Iran is on the cusp of a new cultural revolution being led by...
Cut back to us?
No!
Due to the trauma we are facing, our editors are working around the clock to remove any trace of Ned from past Try Guys content. This is the battle of our lives.
Bro, Jay-Z cheated on Beyonce. It's gonna be okay.
Cut back to us.
This like very dismissive attitude is very pervasive when we talk about celebrity news, influencer news, and like folks being traumatized by something happening not directly to them. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I think there's a very useful and important conversation to be had about parasocial relationships and how we don't have a lot of robust research that's like freely available anyways to really accurately discern how parasocial relationships are affecting our brain and our trauma responses. And so I very much want to encourage folks to honor that while yes, the situation that happened with the Try Guys is very much a big T trauma for them. This is something that like financially, emotionally, physically, mentally very much affected their lives and their relationships and probably their core values and beliefs and like lots of different things, right? This is also potentially a little T trauma for a lot of people, particularly those who were very engaged with them on a parasocial level, because our brain has a hard time discerning between parasocial relationships and like IRL relationships. That's why parasocial relationships are so potentially dangerous if they're not managed well, but also interesting and valuable to advertisers, for example. There's a lot of weight and influence that influencers have in, utilizing and building parasocial relationships. This is also a common thing that happens when, for example, a celebrity dies or there's like distressing news about a public figure. Folks are oftentimes like, what, did you know the guy? Like, why do you care so much? And it's this same dismissive attitude of like, why does this affect you? It shouldn't matter to you. And again, like as the clinician in the room, I just want to encourage folks to honor that your experiences are real and that your feelings about a particular issue are not dramatic or overblown, or you're not being a baby about that if this is something that was legitimately traumatizing to you.
Look at me. This is the face of grief.
No, it's not.
It is, though.
The other thing that I wanted to discuss in this realm was another series of tweets. This first one talking about the John Mulaney divorce was for millennials and the Ned Try Guys divorce will be for Gen Z. I think they meant as the Ned Try Guys divorce will be for Gen Z. There was another tweet that says 2022, the year we realized that wife guys are still guys. This is an interesting take, and I think again a useful conversation to be had, because again trauma is something that causes us to view the world and ourselves and relationships and blah 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 in a different way, right? When we talk about little t trauma, and particularly parasocial little t traumas, I think this is something that we can clearly see happening. It's a very common discourse that's happening on social media and on the internet generally, that folks have an increasing amount of distrust for relationships, particularly relationships with cishet men, but relationships generally, and sort of this overall sense of doom and sadness about the proverbial state of affairs in terms of having relationships with people one-on-one, but also our ability to trust public figures. There's been a lot of distress and frustration and sadness and anger about the ways that celebrities are sort of being exposed for their shitty behavior, having a weird past or saying something fucked up on Twitter 20 years ago, 10 years, whatever. This is an interesting phenomenon to discuss because again, I think people are very dismissive of this trauma as a phenomenon, but this does really influence the way that we view relationships. Again, this is something that we know from the research about trauma. Our brain is wired in such a way that when we have a particular experience enough times, our brain learns that this is a trend and something that we should apply to knowledge later in the future. This is useful, for example, when we talk about our ability to navigate the three-dimensional world, right? You and I can pretty effectively identify something that we would commonly label as a chair, even if it looks different, right? Like a computer chair, a dining room chair, a lounger, one of those shitty chairs at the doctor's office, chairs that are all linked together and don't have any arms at the baseball stadium. Those are all chairs. Even though they look very different, they're different colors, they're in different contexts, and sometimes they serve different purposes, our brain, in trying to help us, applies this set of rules to something that even though on its face they're very different, our brain has categorized them in an easy little way for us to understand. Our brain does this with other things, particularly safe and unsafe circumstances. And so when we talk about little t trauma and parasocial trauma and how all of that influences our brain, it is very much a real possibility that folks are watching influencer relationships and celebrity relationships and public figures' lives fucking implode in real time, and your brain is absorbing this information to mean, oh my God, relationships are maybe not safe, or I can't really trust people, or cishet men in particular are never fucking trustworthy people and they're always fucking shitty human beings, right? Which that's a different conversation for a different day. The point that I'm making is that this dismissive attitude about labeling trauma or parasocial trauma or trauma as a result of celebrity relationships and dealings and those things as wrong or invalid or being bastardizing mental health terms is doing a disservice to the work that mental health professionals are trying to do. If you are a person who is traumatized by this or potentially has, fears about relationships or fears of intimacy or a general distrust or general doom and gloom about the state of affairs, right? With capitalism and relationships and the whole thing, this is a valid thing that I would say all good therapists, most good therapists should be willing to make space for, especially a therapist who is continuing to come back to the roots of the field, because we know that oftentimes these situations especially are not just the situation on its surface, right? Something that seems maybe silly or small and easily dismissed isn't usually about that particular thing. It's about what that thing symbolizes to you and how your brain has interpreted that information and then ran with it. Because again, our brain forming patterns is useful in some regards, but the problem is that when our brain is forming patterns based on a trauma history, our view of the world and ourselves and relationships can become distorted and cause us to feel and behave in ways that are not super helpful to us. I know that this was a little convoluted. I hope that this makes sense. Does this make sense? The general gist that I want y'all to take away from today is that, first of all, trauma is very much up for debate in terms of like what qualifies as trauma. And so if something feels traumatizing to you, it might warrant unpacking that with a licensed professional. There's always links in the description if you want to go find one. And also to really embrace that idea that validating the traumas of others, and especially what someone else is labeling as a trauma, doesn't take away from you. It doesn't make your trauma less valid. And you labeling something that someone else wouldn't label as trauma doesn't mean that you're taking away from someone else. There's plenty of room for us to be traumatized. We're all fucking traumatized, especially those who live in the United States and like other like oppressive places and experience marginalized identities. It's impossible for us to navigate this world without experiencing trauma. And so it is okay for you to accurately and adequately label that and ask for the help that you need to work through that and to feel the feels associated with that. Like I said, I hope that this makes sense. If you find this useful or interesting, like the video. It helps the channel grow, and I'd like to have you stay, so you can also subscribe while you're down there, and share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow. And I will see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.